Today, what we're going to talk about is something that we've kind of implied before, the institution of labor. Um, I know that you know that labor was hugely, hugely important when it comes to empire building in the English system in North America. It was based on agriculture, and anytime that you're talking about agricultural output, you're talking about labor. Um, what we're going to see here today is the increasing use of slave labor, coercive labor, chattel slavery. You'll have a much better idea as to exactly what all of that means here in a second. But one thing that I want to press upon you very early on in this lecture is you can't really effectively build empire without a cheap source of labor. Um, in this capacity, slavery is very much going to be part of empire building. And empire building is going to be very much a part of how slavery grows up and evolves in the English system in the New World. The other thing that are going to really press upon you is that slavery is going to assume different forms and look differently depending on exactly what part of the North American continent that you're talking about. But you can't understand slavery, you can't understand the system that is slavery unless you really focus on the South Atlantic system. And that's really where I want to begin our conversation. Very easy way for you to understand what the South Atlantic system was. It was a triangle trade. For those of you following along with us right now, you're looking at the triangle trade. At the top of that slide right there, it's shaped like a triangle, but it's pretty simple. Europe was the workshop of the world, and we know from previous lectures that they did business in Western Africa. What you had was these European traders that would take their manufactured goods, and I'm talking about things like textiles, talking about things like metal products, alcoholic beverages, and especially firearms, taking them to the western coast of Africa, where they would trade for labor, for slaves. Those slaves would be transported across the Atlantic Ocean. And once they got to the Americas, they would be sold into slavery, where they would be instrumental in the production of cash crops. Things like coffee, things like tobacco in the Virginia colonies, and especially sugar. And I'll talk about sugar here in just a moment. Once those raw materials, those cash crops, were produced, they were sent back across the Atlantic Ocean where Europeans, you guessed it, turned them into manufactured products, and the process would start all over again. This is, in essence, the South Atlantic system. It's the triangle trade that will deeply intertwine the continents of Europe, Africa, and North America. Um, just a moment on cash crops. What cash crops are products that will grow very well in the New World. And best of all, they sell very well on the European marketplace. Hence, we have the term cash crops. It's these cash crops that are really making the English, especially their money in the American empire system. And nowhere was there a bigger cash crop than that of sugar, at least very early on. If you think about the European diet, there's very little that can be made without the ingredient of sugar. And so sugar is not only a cash crop, it's a hugely important cash crop, and it's making England in particular an awful lot of money. It's also very labor intensive. You need a lot of labor. It's very laborious, meaning that it's going to take a very high toll on your labor system, slavery or otherwise. And it's also really dangerous work. The way that sugar was harvested, the way that it was refined, the way that it was processed, generally speaking, was very dangerous work. And the mortality rates in the Caribbean, places like Jamaica or Barbados, they were pretty high. They were very high, as a matter of fact. What was worse is the conditions in which these people toiled. You have to understand how huge of a cash crop that sugar was. And if you understand this, you'll understand that it was actually more cost effective for these sugar plantation owners in places like Barbados to work their slaves around the clock, work them very, very intensely. Don't give them breaks. Don't give them sufficient amounts of food or water or anything like that. Just keep them humming morning, noon, and night. And a lot of people simply keeled over from exhaustion. It was more effective, more cost effective. You could get more bang for your buck. And let's make no mistake about it. That's what slavery was really about, was about getting the most bang for your buck when it comes to a slave economy. In any case, what we see happening here is the beginning of chattel slavery. It was not always that Caribbean sugar growers used property slavery, chattel slaves. Once upon a time, they indentured laborers from England. Well, as you might imagine, that was really difficult to re-recruit. Come work your until your back breaks in the burning hot sun, and you may survive and you may not. And so, over the course of time, people are going to find it far more effective to import their labor in the form of slavery, and they're going to increasingly import it from Africa. So, we're seeing the evolution of the slave system, but I want you to understand that it begins in the Caribbean before it begins on the North American continent itself. And the reason why is sugar. Sugar grew in the Caribbean. It didn't really grow anywhere outside of what would become known as New Orleans, southern Louisiana. And that's where the money evolved first, and that's where colonization evolved first. And consequently, it's going to have an earlier history in the Caribbean. Before we go any further, I want to talk about the process in which slaves became slaves. This process is what historians refer to as the Middle Passage. There's really two primary things that I need you to write down here when it comes to the Middle Passage. The first is that it was literally the boat ride that people took from Africa to the New World. It was the voyage, if you will. I'm not doing this justice, and I'll come back to this point in a second, but there's a transition that also takes place. Keep in mind, in Africa, what they were captives. If you watch that video entitled Western Encounters, I made the case, I made it very, very directly, that slavery existed in Africa, but many of these individuals were what you and I would call captives, prisoners of war, people of that variety. They're captives in Africa, but when they when they transfer across that Atlantic Ocean, they transform into slaves. They become property. Hence, they have the term chattel property slavery. For a moment, I want you to think about the longest, most difficult airplane ride that you've ever taken. For me, I've probably got a good solid 6 hours in me, and after about 6 hours, it does not go well. You were at sea in the 17th century. You were at sea for weeks, sometimes months, and I think that the conditions of the Middle Passage could be best described as oppressive. You need to keep in mind that these people were not seen as passengers, they were seen as cargo. Similar to sugar that was going across the Atlantic Ocean, the more cargo that you could pack on your ship in the form of slaves, the more your profits would be once you got to the New World and unloaded your quote-unquote cargo. And consequently, people were not given very good accommodations. As a matter of fact, if you're looking at that slide with me right now, what looks like spoons or even sardines maybe packed into this cylinder-shaped object, those are actually slaves. Those are actually human bodies that have been chained down and chained together. And everything that you're doing, and we don't need to be really graphic, although you can use your imagination, everything that you're doing, you're doing right there, including dying. The mortality rates of the Middle Passage were terribly, terribly high, and any slave trader might expect his quote-unquote cargo to shrink on the way over. Well, if the guy that you happen to be chained next to, if he dies of dysentery or disease of some variety, what that basically means is you're chained to a corpse for who knows how long, until somebody ventures down into the hull and sees that they're in fact dead and disposes of them. Okay? If you're getting the impression that this is a very brutal process, that this was a very brutal institution, that's pretty much what I need you to get on under your belt. That the Middle Passage was, simply put, oppressive. But back to the story of the uniqueness of American slavery. I want to make something very clear before we go any further, and that's really it's two things. Number one, how one experienced slavery very much depended on exactly where you're talking about, and maybe to a greater extent who exactly was running the show. We know that there was more than one game in town when it comes to the European powers that had sliced apart North America at this particular moment. The other thing that I want to make clear is that slavery was evil no matter where you were talking about, no matter who was calling the shots. It was an evil institution, but it was very different depending on where. Once upon a time, what would become known as New York, including the metropolitan part of New York, New York City, was a Dutch colony. And once upon a time, that Dutch colony was a thriving slave society. The Dutch had brought over slaves, just very similar to how the English and how the French had brought them over in the Caribbean to grow sugar. There was once upon a time slavery in the capital of the Dutch American Empire, and that would be New Amsterdam. Keep in mind what the Dutch are doing over here, though. Unlike Virginia, this is not a colony that's based on agriculture. It's largely based on trade and commerce. So what you need if you're going to have a commercial-based enterprise is you need things like roads. You need bridges. You need buildings, stable water supplies. You need infrastructure. And of course, they needed labor for that. The Dutch East India Company, one of the primary economic institutions within the region, essentially bought these people off of these slave traders, and it was the companies that brought them over, hence we have company slaves. These were individuals that were not owned by specific slave owners, not one person, but they belonged to the company as a whole. They were essentially company property. Now, for a moment, guys, I need you to keep in mind that the climate in those middle colonies, those Dutch colonies, is very different than that of the Caribbean. I know that goes without saying. It's nothing that I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but this was going to play a very important role when it comes to how one experiences slavery in New Amsterdam. Um, because at least half of the year, the ground was covered in snow and ice, and it was not growing season or really even able to get out there and do any kind of work when it comes to construction. Slaves in the Dutch part of North America were granted what was known as half freedoms. Again, I'm not apologizing for slavery, but what I mean by half freedoms is half of the year you would be a slave in the very traditional sense. You'd be expected to build roads and, chop lumber and things of that variety. But then when the weather didn't exactly cooperate, you'd essentially have those months to yourself. Now, let me be very clear about this. The expectation was if the company called, certainly you would be there and you would be ready to take orders. But essentially, this is half the year would be left up to the slaves themselves, and hence you have the term half freedoms. You still have very oppressive elements to this as well. After 1640, similar to the case of John Punch, the conditions of African servitude become more and more permanent. Those individuals that are born to slave parents after 1640, they're not born free. And this particular variety, this particular, shall we say, brand or vision of slavery would expand throughout the region, including into the English parts of the colonies. Of course, I mean Massachusetts. 1665, slavery is alive and well in Massachusetts, even though Massachusetts would be the first state in the country once the United States is formed. Massachusetts would be the first state to officially outlaw that institution. But we need to talk about slavery in another very important setting, and that'd be the Chesapeake. To make sure that you know what the Chesapeake region was, Think about northeastern Virginia, southeastern Maryland. Think about the Chesapeake Bay. Great place to get seafood, especially crab. But that's the region that I'm talking about, and that's what I mean when I say slavery in the Chesapeake. And I'm hopeful at this point in time, you know that the source, the main source of commerce in that region was tobacco. What the tobacco revolution really did is it set up an insatiable need for labor, an insatiable appetite to bring people over. And we know that once upon a time it was indentured servitude that really defined cheap labor in the Chesapeake, and it eventually evolved into chattel property slavery. Um, but again, where you are experiencing slavery is ultimately going to be determinative when it comes to how you're experiencing slavery. Think about the climate in Virginia. It's more mild. It is got a longer growing season. The land itself lends itself to plantation agriculture as opposed to Yemen, hand-to-mouth, small-time farming agriculture. And again, after 1640, many of these tobacco growers have figured it out, and it just makes more economic sense, more financial sense to purchase a slave, purchase them for life, and commit them to the laborious task of producing tobacco for the rest of their days. After 1640, very similar to what you saw with John Punch, you see Virginian planters, Maryland planters as well, finding ways to increase the longevity of these quote-unquote contracts. Keep in mind, there is no legal code for slavery as we have been defining it thus far. It would have to evolve. And after 1640, it does evolve and becomes a very accepted part of Virginia's economy, the Chesapeake economy. 1662 is when you really begin to see this go mainstream within the legal system. In 1662, at least in Virginia, there are legal codes that now officially recognize the legality of chattel slavery. These individuals that are going to be born to slave parents, similar to the Dutch counterparts, they will pass that condition on to their children. You see this legal system as it relates to slavery expand into Maryland in 1665. There are fewer and fewer ways to free oneself. Used to be that you might be able to purchase your freedom, or there were certain things that could get you out of that servitude. Those things are increasingly going away. And let's be honest about this. The economy has a really big determining factor as to why. Slavery was very, very good for business in the sense that you got not only a cheap source of labor, but a very effective one. This made financial sense. And I don't mean that in a good way, but hopefully you can understand where I'm coming from. Now, there is a very unique aspect of Chesapeake slavery, and that is you have a rapidly increasing native-born slave population. Slavery wasn't needed in the Dutch colonies the same way that it was in the Chesapeake. Keep in mind, it's not exactly based on agriculture, and Virginia's economy is based on agriculture. What is going to happen is this milder climate, the fact that you just couldn't get away with executing your slaves. You had to treat them better than slaves were being treated in the Caribbean. You had to give them time off. You had to give them ample food, ample shelter. And the reason why was very simple. The reason why is tobacco farmers were not making as much as sugar farmers. There were things that you could get away with as a sugar farmer. Somebody ran away, you could execute that person, shoot them, and that would make an example of that person so that anybody that got any bright ideas, they would certainly think twice. You could, as I've said, work them around the clock until they just drop dead. You could not do that in the Chesapeake because it was a huge investment, and you were not making the same kind of profit margin as they were elsewhere. So what that does, everybody, is that gives rise to a naturally increasing slave population. because slaves were treated better, they generally lived longer. And as they lived, they did things like got married and had children. And unfortunately, they passed that condition of slavery, servitude, on to the next generation of native born African American slaves. That's really the defining factor of the Chesapeake. This is not an African workforce, it's an African American workforce born and raised on the North American continent. There is another region that I need you to be mindful of, and that would be the Low Country. You call that South Carolina and to a lesser extent Georgia. These colonies are going to be established in 1629. You're going to come to find that out. Um, and ultimately, what these landlords that the king appoints, what they're going to do, and they're going to do this pretty quickly on, is they're going to desperately look for a cash crop, their version of tobacco or sugar or what have you. At the same time, they're importing large sources of labor, including slave labor from Africa. And it's actually these African slaves that give these South Carolinian landlords an idea as to what might just fit when it comes to a cash crop in their neck of the woods. And that was Aroisa. Now, officially what Aroisa was rice. If you think about some of the things that South Carolina and Georgia are known for, it's the production of rice. And it's going to be Aroisa that becomes the cash crop. But I got to have you ask yourself, these landlords, they're English. They're people from London and Manchester, right? And you really got to ask yourself, what in the world would somebody from that part of the world know about the production of rice? Rice doesn't grow in England. It doesn't grow anywhere near England. It's the Africans that are bringing over the Aroisa, the rice. Aroisa had been grown in Africa for generations, and there were some on these ships that came over, and the climate was very hospitable when it comes to growing rice. You need wetlands, and naturally this just kind of transitioned into the New World. And it's just kind of ironic that it was the African slaves that actually introduced the basis of the economy in places like South Carolina, Aroisa. But again, the context matters greatly. Think about this for a second. The conditions are going to be very different than growing tobacco in the Chesapeake. If you know anything about growing rice, you know it likes to grow in water. And that means that you're going to be growing this stuff in things like swamps and wetlands. Sometimes you'd be ankle deep in mud and water. Sometimes, if you're looking at the slide there with me, knee deep in it. And of course, these swamps and other wetlands were infested with mosquitoes that carried things like malaria. And where I'm going with all of this is similar to the Caribbean. The mortality rates of South Carolina, of the Low Country generally speaking, were pretty high. They were certainly much higher than what you would have seen in Virginia. Now, not only is this distinguishing from the way that slavery was experienced in Virginia, it also means that these high mortality rates, you're going to have to replace these people, right? These people, when they start dropping, you're going to need to buy somebody new. And what that means is, unlike Virginia, where you're seeing the emergence of an African American workforce, what you've got in the Low Country is an African and then re-Africanized workforce. These are people that are African. They're not people that were born on the North American continent. In many ways, slavery, as it was experienced and as it was practiced even in the Low Country, was much more similar to that of the Caribbean model than it was even a few hundred miles to the north in the Chesapeake. So I'm hopeful that this helps you to see that the context and the setting and even who's calling the shots is really determinative when it comes to how slavery is ultimately going to unfold. There's one more group and one more region that I'd like to talk to you about before I let you go, and that would be the French. I know that you know that the French are going to colonize this big swath of territory that will eventually become known as Louisiana. It's more than just simply the modern day state of Louisiana. It's everything north and west of this contemporary city, New Orleans. Huge, huge trek of land. But it's in that southeastern part that I really want to focus because that's where you're going to begin to see slavery catching on directly with the French. Okay. Now, keep in mind, for all intents and purposes, what the French were doing very early on in America was business with the Native Americans. It was the fur trade that really put them on the map. But by this point in time, by the early 17th century, maybe early 18th century, if you want to be very safe, the English had demonstrated that you could make a lot of money through agriculture, and the French just simply wanted to try their hands at this. They wanted to follow in the English footsteps, so to speak. To do this, you needed a cash crop. Think about what likes to grow in southern Louisiana. There's a reason that every year there's a college football game that's played in New Orleans called the Sugar Bowl, and because that's going to become a cash crop for the southern part of Louisiana. It's maybe one of the only places that sugar grows on the North American continent, and the French basically own it. The big difference is what the French were essentially allowed to do with their slaves as opposed to the English in a place like South Carolina. The French were governed by a set of rules that come to be known as the Code Noir. If you speak French, you'll know that that translates into black codes. This was a series of codes and legal regulations that determined what you could and could not do. For example, you could not punish somebody by death for running away or being disobedient. If you had a couple that was married, you could not split them up. You couldn't sell the wife one way and the husband another way. Couldn't split children apart from parents. Part of the reason that the Code Noir functioned the way that it did is because the Catholic Church, keep in mind we are talking about the French, Catholic nation, but the Catholic Church was deeply involved in the system of slavery in Louisiana. And it regulated exactly what kind of practices were and were not permissible in slavery. Now, another very unique element of French North American slavery would be a group that the French would refer to as the Yen de couleur libre. And again, if you speak French, that translates into free people of color. The case of Frederick Douglass is a useful example here. Frederick Douglass was long rumored that his father was not only white, but the owner of the plantation in Maryland. And he was a slave because his mother was African American. She was a slave. And in the English model, the way that this works is the condition of the child follows that of the mother. So it didn't matter that your father was white. It didn't even matter that your father owned the whole Tuckahoe plantation. If your mother was African ancestry and a slave, that meant that you were a slave. The French were very different in that capacity. And again, I'm not apologizing for it. I'm just trying to point out that it's different. It was widely known that many of these Frenchmen had relations with their female slaves. And many times these relationships resulted in children. But these children were born free. And not only were they born free, if you bear in mind for a second that many of these planters, these sugar planters, were doing quite well for themselves, many of them were born into a relatively well-to-do family. And some of them grew up in pretty good conditions. Not only are they free, but they have a little bit of economic resource as well. I want to draw your attention to that mansion at the bottom of the screen right there. That's the Melrose Plantation in northwestern Louisiana. It's actually still there. You can tour it if you like. That's Melrose. And once upon a time, Melrose was owned by free people of color, and they actually did own slaves as well. And so this is a very unique aspect of the French version of slavery in the North American continent. And it's very different than the English model. And it's primarily because the people that were running the program there looked at the world very differently. Catholic Church is going to introduce some things that just would not fly in the English model. But whatever the case is, I really do want to press upon you that slavery was a system that was deeply a part of colonization and imperialism. What it was designed to do was get the most bang for the buck when it comes to production. And it turned out to be very efficient. I don't mean that in a good way. I'm just saying that these people that did well in the New World, they did very well because that labor force was not only cheap, but it was also very docile. They could really manipulate it to get them to do exactly what they wanted them to do. I'd also like to summarize and conclude this section by re-emphasizing the idea that slavery was experienced very differently in different parts of the North American continent, and it was also experienced very differently with respect to exactly which European model that you're talking about. But what the combination of imperialism and slavery is ultimately going to do is it's going to make England, France, to a lesser extent Spain, the richest and most powerful countries anywhere of the world at the time. It is going to lay into foundation a system where Europe's economy, at least Western Europe's economy, is really, really going to thrive. But it's going to thrive on the backs of slaves. It's going to thrive because they were able to coerce their labor to do this backbreaking work that proved to be so profitable over the course of the longue durée. This is certainly not the last time that we're going to talk about slavery. The next time I meet with you, we're going to talk about not only how the slave world looked and how one functioned within it, we're also going to talk about the institution of resistance. It's not as simple as slaves just, obeyed their masters' orders indiscriminately and never asked questions. You'll see what I mean the next time we meet.